Here we are. So welcome to the Platypus Affiliated Society at Goldsmiths. This is our first panel this year, so we're pleased to have you all here. I'm going to do a little introduction to Platypus and the things we've got going on this term. Then I'll introduce the panelists and read the panel description briefly. And then the way the panel's going to work is we're going to have around 10 minutes for each of the panelists to give opening remarks. Then they'll have a couple of minutes each to respond to each other, and then we'll open it up to you guys for a Q&A. So, the Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organises reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 20s to 30s, new 60s to 70s, and post-political 80s to 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. At our chapter at Goldsmiths, we host our weekly reading group on Sundays from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. in room 257 at the Richard Hogarth building, just over the road. And we host coffee breaks on Fridays, which is a more informal kind of conversation, from 5 to 6 p.m. in the 35 Cafe in the Richard Hogarth building. The Platypus Review is free and open submission. Please feel free to take some copies. There are also copies of 1917, the IBT Journal, the Weekly Worker, and the Labour Party Marxists. And feel free to have a look and take some of those. You can find out about our London-wide events. We also have a chapter at LSE. On our London Platypus Facebook group, or at our website platypus1917.org/London. If you'd like to get updates about our regular activities, please sign up for the mailing list, which we'll pass around. And you can also follow our Facebook page, which is Platypus Goldsmiths. Right, so without further ado, I'll introduce our panelists. Immediately next to me is Lyndon White. Lyndon's been political education officer at the East Finchley branch of the Labour Party, and that was after rejoining the Labour Party in 2015, having been involved in one form or another with the revolutionary left for many cold, hard years. Next to Lyndon is Robert Liow, aka Bobby's son. He's a writer, poet, law student, and international student activist at King's College, where he founded and is president of the International Students' Rights Campaign. He is also currently the Higher Education Coordinator for One Day Without Us 2018, a campaign group that organises an annual day of action to celebrate migrants in the UK. His views are his own. Next to Robert is HaPe Breitman. HaPe is a supporter of the international Bolshevik tendency. He was active for some time in Germany before moving to Britain a few years ago. The IBT is an international Trotskyist group which originated in the international Spartacist tendency and emerged from expulsions and splits in the early 1980s. And on the end, last but not least, Jack Conrad is a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain. He is a regular contributor to its paper, The Weekly Worker. So, the sickness of Labourism. Labour lost the election, but Jeremy Corbyn, a veteran of the 1980s Labour left, seems to have saved the party. Corbyn's tenure has raised old questions about the left's relationship to the Labour Party. While some on the left take the crisis within Labour to be an opportunity, in various ways, for its transformation, others reject Labour as a dead end. For Ralph Miliband, the crisis of Stalinism and welfare state social democracy in the 1950s raised the problem of the political party for socialism. He thought Labour's defeat in the 1959 general election made apparent what would have otherwise been obscure, that, quote, the Labour Party is a sick party. This sickness was taken as an opportunity for the left to clarify the nature of the Labour Party and go beyond the Labourism which had defined it up until that point. The New Left sought to leverage this moment to educate a new generation, as Miliband puts it, into the promise and the conditions for socialism in the 1960s. However, by the early 1970s, Miliband felt that this opportunity had passed. How should we understand Labour's metaphorical sickness? Should we seek to save the patient or to learn from its death? So without further ado, I think we'll start on the far end with Jack.
Okay, 10 minutes. I'm looking at the questions that the comrades posed in order to stimulate discussion, and so I'll just bang through them and see where I get to. First of all, they ask, what is Labourism? My answer to that is, well, I think it's liberalism as taken up by the trade union movement, specifically the trade union bureaucracy. In terms of its origins, it had no vision beyond capitalism, operating in a way that was less antagonistic to the trade union movement and the working class. It's true that in 1918, under Sidney Webb, it adopted the famous Clause 4. This was deliberately written in a Lassallean way, an anti-Marxist way. It was there in order to divert the workers in Britain who were sympathetic to the Russian Revolution into what is, to all intents and purposes, nothing to do with socialism. What Clause 4 actually advocates, of course, is state capitalism. The idea of abolishing wage slavery doesn't occur to them. All you need to do is nationalise the commanding heights of the economy. We carry on working. It's not the bosses of the old sort that benefit from it. Instead, we have a new class of bureaucrats. That's the vision. How seriously they ever took it, I don't know. I doubt it. Didn't Harold Wilson, Labour Prime Minister, famously say, well, we talk about these things but we don't do them? So Labourism to me, really, with Clause 4, without Clause 4, to all intents and purposes, is old-fashioned 19th century liberalism grafted on to the rising labour movement of the 20th century. What relationship has Labourism got to do with socialism? I think I've already answered that. What did Ralph Miliband teach the New Left? I don't know. I mean, reading his article, I wasn't impressed. I've read, of course, his Parliamentary Socialism, which I think is an excellent book. But as an individual, he does strike me as a bit of a flippy-floppy. You know, that come this election he's there, come that particular movement he's over there. My memory certainly was, you talk about the 1980s, that he then went back to the Labour Party because of Bennism. I suspect if he was alive today, he would be back in the Labour Party because of Corbynism. So I don't know what Miliband has taught people. All you can do is, in that sense, look at the existing non-Labour left, and a lot of them used to be in the Labour Party until the 1960s. My sort of memory is sort of 65, 66, 67, 68, and apart from Militant, I think everyone had gone. And I don't know about Ralph Miliband, but I very much suspect that he had as well. What about Corbyn? Wow. Well, in my view, Corbyn on one level shows the role of accident in history. I mean, sitting here, I don't know how many years ago, but would it be 2, certainly 3? Jeremy Corbyn is leader of the Labour Party. Personally, if I was saying that, take me out and give me some heavy drugs. It ain't going to happen. It cannot happen. And of course, what it relied on is the self-confessed morons. Let's give the Labour left a chance. And as soon as they did that, I remember watching the first BBC debate between the candidates. This was in Nuneaton, which apparently is one of those marginal seats. This consisted entirely of ex-Labour voters. So there was a big crowd that the BBC got together. And at that moment, I said to myself, out loud, there's no one else there, bugger me, Jeremy Corbyn is going to win. Because again, talking about the role of accident in history, A few years back, the Labour Party had something called the Collins Review, and one of their big ideas was to have £3 membership. And of course the idea was that it would be the Daily Mirror, the Guardian, maybe the Sun that would decide the leader of the Labour Party. They never predicted, of course, because of the number of MPs that have to vote for a candidate, that it would be someone like Jeremy Corbyn. And what you had, of course, is masses of people taking out their £3 membership. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn won by a landslide. What are Jeremy Corbyn's politics? I'd say they are left Labourite. If you want to call him a socialist, call him a socialist. But he's not a socialist, in my view, that's talking about human liberation. Does that mean, though, that the left, the revolutionary left, the Marxist left, people who do believe in human liberation should just say, well, Corbyn's the leader of the Labour Party, look at the history of the Labour Party, it's rotten, they supported NATO, they supported 2 imperialist wars, their vision has never gone beyond state capitalism, note this, ignore it and do our own thing. I think that would be a fundamental mistake, and what we've been arguing for a whole number of years is that what the left could do, not has to do, but could do, is to turn the Labour Party into something that we have called a permanent united front. And the example that I can give from history of a permanent united front are the Soviets in Russia in 1917, and in the Soviets we saw not only comrades like HaPe from the IBT, but comrades like myself, Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, and I think if you read the book by, is it Abramovich? Does it ring a name? What's the name of the book? Can the Bolsheviks in power? Is it Lyndon?
Bolsheviks in power.
Anyway, whatever the name of the book is, whoever the author is, he actually lists 60 different left groups. All of them were in the Soviets. So I don't think you can transform the Labour Party into a revolutionary party, but what I think you can transform it into is a united front of a special type, a permanent type that is dominated by revolutionaries such as myself.
Okay, thank you very much. HaPe, are you ready to go next?
Yep, 1 second. Okay. Lenin once famously described the Labour Party as a bourgeois workers' party. It is a workers' party because its predominant sociological base consists of that class that holds the key to liberate humanity from capitalism. It is a bourgeois party in terms of its political program. Labour, unlike other bourgeois workers' parties in Europe, never claimed to be Marxist, and Marxists, in as far as they existed in the ranks of Labour, were always a minority current. Instead, Labour has always followed a Fabianite vision according to which we just need to redistribute some wealth within society a little bit. They chose to describe this as socialist, but the term they chose to describe this as socialist, but then various unambiguous bourgeois organizations occasionally wheel out that term when they try to gain some support from the left. For Marxists to believe that capitalism needs to be destroyed and replaced by a communist society, Fabianism is entirely insufficient. There are various groups on the left who consider redistributive policies as somewhat transitional to socialist aims, but oversee that rather than leading to a higher socialist goal, these measures are in place to prevent the working class from developing revolutionary class consciousness. The measures are put in place because even the current Labour leadership under Corbyn understands that the strained social fabric in Britain's capitalist society requires a party that can channel class struggle aspirations into parliamentarian politics. Corbyn expressed this in various ways. While declaring his will to maintain unity with those on the right, trying to oust him by any means at their disposal, he has failed to defend those on the Labour left barred for various bogus charges. He has committed himself to further immigration controls once Brexit has become reality, And at the beginning of his ascendancy as a Labour leader, Corbyn advised that unfortunately the working class would have to wait for him to be elected as a Prime Minister in the next general elections in order to end what he termed Tory austerity. He passively declared his support for one or the other strike, but he has never called on workers or the trade union leaders who play crucial roles in the formulation of Labour's programme to call for strikes, to oppose attacks on our living standards. In fact, he calls to just take back those anti-union laws passed by the Tories, leaving in place the laws implemented under preceding Labour governments. John McDonnell recently even went as far as openly admitting that there wouldn't be any real pay rises if Labour came to power soon. Corbyn gave in to the pressure to call for scrapping Trident. He is in favour of putting more police into the streets, and critically, he has instructed Labour councils to carry out those austerity measures they are told to implement by the current government. Not that they weren't already well practiced in doing so under previous Labour governments. Yet Corbyn has been able to revert Labour's trend in recent decades to become a purely bourgeois party. His Keynesianist programme, long challenged by the right as socialist, recently former Tory cabinet minister David Willetts even suggested it implied a Marxist revolution, presents something unheard of over the last 2 or 3 decades. Suggestions to nationalise the railways or mentions of the rich so that the victims of the murderous Grenfell fire can have decent housing has certainly contributed to his popularity, as have his calls to scrapping tuition fees, additional funding for education, or the battered NHS. The only reason why this sounds radical is the fragmentation of the neoliberal dogma which dominated the political mainstream, including Labour. The rapid influx of new working class members into Labour following Corbyn's candidacy as a leader and the re-affiliation of the firefighters union FBU in 2015 stresses the fact that Labour remains a bourgeois workers' party. Despite the Labour left's political retreat prior to Corbyn's emergence, Labour has been a strategic asset to Britain's ruling class, and not, as Ralph Miliband and with him various self-styled Trotskyist groups assert, a party simply torn between the capitalists and the working class with the potential to become a fully fledged socialist party. Labour's existence has been instrumental in reducing the chances for the emergence of a mass revolutionary party. In Britain's biggest pre-revolutionary crisis during the general strike in 1926, the Labour leadership was firmly intent in averting the transformation of the strike into a successful challenge to the power of the capitalist class. Unfortunately, back then, the Communist Party assisted the Labour leaders by relying on their most left-wing representatives rather than fighting for communist leadership of the strike. This reliance on Labour leaders runs like a red thread through the history of supposedly revolutionary organisations and their relationship with the Labour Party, an illusion that perhaps Labour could be a force of good. After more than a century of class treachery, it is impossible that Labour could ever be transformed into a revolutionary party. It is obvious, however, that revolutionaries are scarce in Britain and nowhere close to establishing a mass revolutionary party. Considering that many workers have genuine illusions in Corbyn's programme, it makes perfect sense to engage with those sections within and around Labour who would like to see an end to and reversal of austerity, a life without imperialist wars and racism, and a real perspective in life beyond mere survival. Corbyn's programme is utterly insufficient to achieve any of these aspirations. In a small scale, he has already demonstrated that he has no plans to and cannot implement any of his programmatic aims, since he relies on the capitalist framework and associated budgetary restraints. His meek calls for nationalisation of some poorly managed industries have nothing in common with the communist aim of expropriating the bourgeoisie and coordinating the industry in a democratically established plan. Those who continue to have illusions in Corbyn are unlikely to see the need for a democratically planned economy preceded by a socialist revolution at this stage. Instead, they might believe that Corbyn's idea can be successfully put into practice, ignoring the fate that similar formations such as Syriza in Greece have undergone. For now, Labour retains the ideological hegemony over the British working class. Revolutionaries have tools to address this disjuncture between the need for a successful revolution on the one hand and mass illusions in reforms within the framework of a market economy on the other hand. These were not developed by the New Left, but the Communist International during its revolutionary period, and Leon Trotsky thereafter. In 1920, Lenin suggested that giving a critical vote to Labour in the general elections was permissible under the precondition that the Communist Party's propaganda made it clear that the Labour government would sell out on its promises. By being open about this outcome, this tactic could assist in breaking the most advanced layers away from Labour towards the establishment of a revolutionary party that deserved to be called a party. This is very unlike the automatic vote for Labour that groups like the CPGB have propagated, regardless of whether Labour promised anything to the working class or not. Undoubtedly, a call to vote for Labour, even at times when Labour was in the driving seat of attacks on the working class, would suggest that there was something fundamentally beneficial in the Labour Party itself. Another method suggested by Trotsky in the 1930s was that of time-limited entryism in instances where bourgeois workers' party was temporarily moving to the left under the pressure of the working class membership. Unlike the deep entryism practiced by a large number of leftist groups, Trotsky aimed to polarizing the bourgeois workers' party on the basis of those programmatic demands that are adaptable to a revolutionary program. By focusing the internal debates on these items and demonstrating that the party's leadership was not willing to seriously fight for these issues, especially not with extra-parliamentarian measures, such as strikes and the like, revolutionary currents within the bourgeois workers' party could split it along programmatic lines. Again, such a split could serve the formation of a larger revolutionary current with a bigger base to conduct revolutionary works in other fields, like trade unions, to build a genuine alternative to Labour from the left, committed to the overthrow of capitalism. It is possibilities like these that the Labour leadership fears the most, which could lead to the first step towards a party that can bring about a genuine Marxist socialism. In Britain, such a party would be an internationalist party attempting to establish program-based connections with like-minded organizations across the globe. It would fight to end imperialist wars globally and call for British troops out of Northern Ireland and elsewhere. It would conduct a struggle within the trade unions on the basis of the transitional program, linking bread and butter struggles with the perspective of socialist revolution. And it would fight for ethnic minorities, women and the LGBT community to achieve full equal rights and opportunities, an aim only achievable under a communist society.
The first thing I'd like to tackle is what is Labourism and how does it relate, if at all, to socialism. So I read the Miliband article. I believe that Labourism is the departure of the Labour Party from the goal of common ownership and broadly, in this modern context, away from actual radical visions towards social reformism in favour of electoral gains. Labour rejects the radical demands of socialism, and it's not just against class oppression but also against racism, sexism, imperialism and other pillars of oppression. It merely seeks the victory of the Labour Party through electorally sound policies that try and capture the right rather than motivating the left. And in doing so, this is not only opportunist but also electorally damaging. I mean, if you look at what these opportunist policies are right now, you can see, like, as what was mentioned earlier, like concessions to the right on Brexit, on freedom of movement. Like, they've accepted the thesis, for example, that the migration of European workers, despite being empirically disproven, is damaging to the wages of British workers. So the failure to make these radical demands is a failure of socialist principles and a failure to provide a serious and a hopeful alternative to the right. And thus, even in the context of implementing parliamentary socialism, Labourism is a disease that burdens the Labour Party. So what sort of opportunity does Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party offer for the left? It offers both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, Corbyn is an inspiring figure for a generation that has lived through crisis, austerity and a succession of governments determined to strip away the protections that the British state offers to its citizens. During his campaign for Labour leader, when he was on the offensive against the Conservative government and during the recent general election, he was a figure of hope around which much of the students and the Labour movement rallied. Corbyn's promise of socialism, which even now survives to some extent, was a refreshment and a real hopeful alternative to the grim austerity of the Conservative Party and the Labour right. The attention Corbyn has brought to socialism has given the left a radical, passionate and tightly networked base among which to mobilise for more radical demands which we should take advantage of. This is even more important as Corbyn slowly shifts away from his radical demands and vacillates on freedom of movement and Brexit. The left now has the opportunity to capture dissatisfied Corbynites, some of whom can be found organising within Labour, such as the Labour campaign for free movement, as well as outside of it. A better world has been promised, and then rudely taken away. And the shock of this has created a crisis that we can, should, and take advantage of to push for a more radical vision that doesn't necessarily depend on Labour. Unfortunately, the iconic figure that Corbyn makes is a challenge for the left for the exact same reasons it is an opportunity. I don't necessarily believe that cults of personality are bad, but the cult of personality around Corbyn makes it hard to convince radicals who are enamored of him that they should not only fight to prevent him and the Labour Party as a whole from backsliding into Labourism, but also to look beyond Labour in their attempts to build socialism. Corbyn's positions on Brexit and freedom of movement in particular are reactionary concessions to the right, and regardless of whether Corbyn can be convinced on this, radicals must resist Brexit and preserve freedom of movement, the end of which would be a major victory for the right in this country and a blow against anti-racist and anti-xenophobic internationalist efforts. Now, the final question I want to answer is, why isn't there a mass socialist party in the UK? What would it look like and how can we get there? Now, I believe one of the biggest reasons there isn't a mass socialist party in the UK is the sheer dominance of liberal and explicitly right-wing voices in the media space and the prominence of what I refer to as radical liberals competing for attention with genuine leftists. In the mainstream media space, the right and mainstream liberalism can leverage the broadcast, publication and distribution machinery to disseminate their version of news further than the left, not having the pre-existing reach of papers like The Sun or The Standard or The Guardian. And in the media space in general, particularly social media, radical liberals are getting more popular as the struggle against the right intensifies. Radical liberals are people who take positions that are broadly anti-oppressive but also extremely individualized, as is the way of liberalism. They believe in individual liberalism. They take personal experience as absolute truth, and they see identity-based oppressions as unique oppressions outside the class framework rather than as part of the interlinked structure that keeps capitalism in place. Thus, you have a distraction from the left, as it were, by people who claim to be radical but are actually liberals, by people who criticize socialism as white, male, and or colonial, despite the millions of non-white, non-male, third-world socialists inside and outside the West, including many radical liberal icons who by their very existence, contributions to theory and praxis, and victories over the West prove the radical liberals wrong on their own grounds. Radical liberal theory is appealing, particularly to marginalized sections of the population, because like socialist theory, it provides a hopeful and radical alternative to the horrors of modern capitalism, but also because it appeals to identitarian impulses. This is the key aspect from which I believe a mass socialist party can learn, should learn, and in fact an aspect that many historically existing socialist parties and revolutions have taken advantage of. Victorious anti-colonial and anti-imperialist socialist movements like those of China and Vietnam have made identitarian appeals to nationalism or nation-statism, which I call this because multiple ethnic nations might exist within a single purported nation state. This is to leverage solidarity that already existed in pre-existing communities as a building block for socialism. For example, China's new democracy drew upon the need for the Chinese people comprised of the multiple ethnic nations within China to unite and defeat first the Japanese invader and then the Kuomintang traitor. We must look to the past and to what has historically worked in the harshest of conditions to determine the future right now. We are seeing a sharpening contradiction between the increasing fragmentation of society into identity groups and the rightist urge of those dominant identities to preserve the old capitalist and nation-status order through suppressing those of marginalized identities. And to win against the right, the left must build a mass socialist party, and to get there we cannot simply return to calls for working-class solidarity to do not recognize identity. Instead, this contradiction must be resolved by creating a mass socialist party that explicitly recognizes and explains identity as a component of class and class as a vital function of identity in terms of access to capital. My vision of this mass socialist party is based on extending the principle of national personal autonomy developed by the Austro-Marxists while retaining elements of democratic centralism. This party would be a party led by the working class, but also a party with a federal structure based around co-equal cultural national identification divisions, the membership of which would be self-identifying within reason. For example, a white person would not be able to join like a people of color cultural national division from any of like the people of color groups. these cultural national divisions would represent their cultures in decision making. However, at the cross-cultural national level, there would also exist separate self-identifying identity divisions, such as a marginalized gender division, LGBTQ division, and a separate trans group to combat sexism within the LGBT plus community. Decision-making within such a party would take a democratic centralist model where cultural national divisions are concerned with an absolute right to consider, veto, or amend policy and identity divisions. We can get there by doing what I was mentioned earlier, by taking the advantage that we've already got a passionate and tightly networked base among which to mobilize a base which is conscious of race, of gender, of sexuality, of orientation, doesn't see them represented within the Labour Party. We have to go for this base, and as what was mentioned just now, as what was suggested by Trotsky, split the Labour Party. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And finally,
Okay, thanks for inviting me to speak. I am speaking in a personal capacity. I am a Labour Party member, but I am not talking on behalf of the Labour Party in my local area or anywhere, so these are very much my personal views in case anybody from the Labour Compliance Unit is actually taping. So I'd just like to make that clear. First of all, I'll go through some of the questions that the Platypus comrades presented to me. First of all, what is Labourism? How does it relate, if at all, to socialism? Well, Miliband actually had quite a good definition of it himself, which kind of concurs a little bit with what John and the IBT comrade kind of said as well. Miliband called it an ideology of social reform within the framework of capitalism with no serious ambition of transcending that framework. Well, that's perfectly correct, but that in the history of the Labour Party, that basic definition has been stretched and in circumstances has changed around through the periods of the Labour Party history, and what you've actually had, as you have at the current time, is groups and individuals within the Labour Party have sought to press against those kind of like boundaries, this idea that you can't transcend capitalism. So within the history of the Labour Party, in the 1920s and the 1930s, the Communist Party of Great Britain organised itself pretty much within the Labour Party and pushed against those boundaries, and in contradiction, I have to say, to the IBT comrade, the CPGB comrades in the 1920s and 1930s had no illusions whatsoever in the Labour Party, because they were being witch hunted and driven out, and they introduced strong communist ideas into the Labour Party's kind of into the Labour Party's life, to that extent they were much more powerful than the left-wing groups we have in the Labour Party at the moment. And this carries on through Labour's kind of history, this kind of tension between this overall kind of reformist, very safe, soft kind of thing that you get from the Labour right. I'm not quite old enough to be active in the Labour Party in this period, but Bennism and the militant tendency in the 1980s, they were like rooted groups within the Labour Party that had, I don't agree with either of them as it goes, but they were rooted groups within the Labour Party that looked to kind of push against that kind of idea that the Labour Party was just about reforming capitalism, albeit with some pretty kind of strange kind of ideas. The militant had this idea, the nationalisation of the top 200 companies, and that's how you achieve socialism, and then you just do that, and that Parliament nationalises the top 200 companies, and that's it. We're living under socialism, hooray! So I'm not trying to paint these groups as perfect, but there's always been this tension within this Labour Party between the right and the left, and usually that left-wing challenge has come from parties that have got a separate existence to the Labour Party in some ways. Even though after the Second World War, even though the CPGB, the Communist Party of Great Britain, I'm talking about the old Communist Party of Great Britain, which was a much larger organisation than any of the organisations on the left that we're kind of used to now, the CPGB still exercised a massive influence on the Labour left. If you look at the old Communist Party programme, which was called the British Road to Socialism, if ever you want to get to sleep at night, I recommend tucking into it. But the British Road to Socialism was the programme of the Labour left. Its idea was very much the same as Corbyn kind of presents in some ways, the idea that you have a steadily leftward moving set of Labour governments till we eventually arrive at the really good one at the end, which will bring us socialism. Those ideas of Corbyn and to some extent MacDonald, to the extent that they have any ideological baggage, their ideological baggage is old Communist Party kind of politics, the British road to socialism. That's what it kind of is. On the second question that the Platypus comrades posed to me, it kind of the one I kind of picked out is what was the New Left able to teach subsequent generations, and obviously Miliband is loosely kind of classed as a member of the New Left. Well, the New Left is a I don't actually know what the New Left could be. Any one of a number of things. It could be the New Left Review, which came up in the 1950s. The New Left that I'm kind of familiar with, because it was that led the revolutionary movement when I became involved in the late 1980s, was the one, the post-68 kind of New Left. And my experience of that kind of New Left was it had very little actually to teach subsequent generations, and I'm as marked as that because I was taught by these people. They had very little actually to say to you actually on Labourism, or understanding why Labourism is such a huge block, because a lot of the New Left I came in was immersed in sex. Small groups that lived on the not sex. I know what you're thinking. SECTS. Okay, little sects on the margins of society that had no real perspective of understanding the motive forces of British politics. What is the Labour Party? And they were kind of immersed in a kind of tiny world on the fringes of that, and they were organised in kind of ideologically rigid and dogmatic organisations that I joined as a kid, and which were, frankly, that they did give me an education of sorts, but they were useless really in terms of what the goals that they set themselves, i.e. a communist society, and the means by which they went about this. So the New Left, and then the other parts of that New Left generation, where you've got people like Eric Hobsbawm, who's a great historian. But what Eric Hobsbawm became politically was kind of just another kind of Euro-communist, right-wing kind of Labourite. I mean, in his terms of, he became a supporter of all sorts of, bizarre organisations and things. And so the New Left I think it's a very loose and kind of nebulous term, and I don't actually understand, there's no New Left programme. But of course, if you go into your libraries, you'll see 100 books to say how funky and great the New Left. I know a lot of the historians who write those kind of books. You will find that, and that is interesting, and it is an interesting kind of history, and the individuals are interesting. So I'm not being completely negative, but it was a very strange kind of beast. I'm not sure it's even one thing. What sort of opportunity does Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party offer the left, if any? Well, it's contradictory. On one level, yes, of course, it offers a huge opportunity, because you've got huge amounts of people who have been drawn into an organisation, admittedly on the basis of the most loose, idea of what. I mean, most of my comrades in the Labour Party, I don't think any of them have got much idea of what. If you say what is socialism, that is a very difficult question to pose in the Labour Party, because it's kind of it's nationalisation of trains is one answer I had, or it's we must take the water back into public ownership. Well, that is not socialism, and that is the contradictions of it, because on one level you've got thousands of people have joined this organisation, but on a completely kind of, it's very nebulous, and it's actually weird being in the Labour Party, right? It is weird if you come from any kind of socialist background. Or you've any kind of training on the socialist or revolutionary left, all your preconceptions are pretty much, because it's such a strange kind of environment, because it's so uncoordinated and loose, and it's diffuse, and people have really got no much idea. And in that circumstances, the only thing that does tend to hold it together is an admiration for Corbyn, which has got its advantages and its kind of disadvantages. And it does offer the left an opportunity, but unfortunately what I've seen from a lot of the revolutionary left, it's rather like going to the zoo and looking at fish in a fish tank. they've got the same kind of perspective, because actually you can't learn very much about fish by looking at it in Regent's Park Zoo through a fish tank. You're not going to learn much about the fish, its life cycle, its habitat, or anything. You're not going to learn anything. And the left views it through this kind of prism. And when I look at when you're involved in struggles in the Labour Party, which can be quite vicious against the right wing who are organised, to actually read like left-wing publications like Socialist Worker and Socialist, which is kind of half cheering you on for a distance, but kind of saying what you're doing is absolutely useless. I just find it, even from the perspective, if I was in those organisations, I would kind of say, look at all this raw material for our organisations. I don't understand the left's. It's a very peculiar view, and it's mostly fear. It's mostly fear. They're organised around democratic centralist kind of regimes, and they're frightened because if you have to go into those kind of organisations, I think some of them would dissipate quite quickly. Because while they're organised around hard democratic centralist kind of organisation, their actual ideas that they put across day to day of strikes, demonstrations, well, you can find all of that in the Labour Party. And so if you go into the Labour Party, you have to have kind of some kind of conception of what you're going to do. And I don't think they've got any conception, and I think that they would be worried that they would lose members. Finally, why isn't there a mass socialist party in the UK? Well, what would it look like, and how can we get there? Well, my kind of conception of why there isn't a mass socialist party in the UK, the Labour Party isn't a socialist party, but it's a huge and formidable roadblock for any so-called socialist party that you might project into the future. And in the current circumstances, the idea of actually forming a new socialist party it would be a ridiculous one, because you'd come up straight up against the problems which organisations which existed a few yeers ago to kind of propagate this idea of a new mass socialist party. Left Unity would be one. As soon as Corbyn got leadership of the Labour Party, they were smote into dust, because they couldn't. What's the point of being in Left Unity when there's this great big roadblock and all these people, and it's got a so-called socialist leadership who's got policies which you're not very much to the left of, and it's the same with other organisations like Trade Union and Socialist Coalition. They're all coming into dust. So, what would a mass socialist party look like in the UK? Well, it would be one of it wouldn't be an ideologically rigid sect based upon one understanding of the history of the workers' movement in the 20th and 21st century. It would need to be a broad, properly mass organisation that pulled in many different viewpoints and very many different trends and tendencies, and could argue those coherently, could argue out its differences currently. It was open, and it could embrace all the major tendencies on the left. So I think that's what it looked like. How we can get there, I'll have to leave that one because that will take quite a long time.
Alright, thank you very much. We'll turn it back to Jack now. You've each got 2 to 3 minutes to just respond to a few points. I'm going to tap on the table if you're running over, because I want to get to the audience.
Yeah, thanks very much. That was interesting. So what I'm going to do, I think, is to pick out mainly what I disagree with, really, because what's the point of just nodding along with it? So merely because I'm picking on that doesn't mean I dismiss everything that's being said, far from it. Okay. Right. Well, okay, let's just begin with the idea of splitting the Labour Party. Well, from my perspective, I think that's just crazy. From my perspective, yes, drive out the right. Why on earth should we as revolutionaries leave the right with the trade union movement, with the cooperative movement? Why on earth should we leave them with that historically rooted organisation? In my view, if you take most of the parliamentary Labour Party, if you take most of the councillors, if you take, the Jewish Labour movement, Lyndon, Progress, Business Labour, it exists. these organisations should have no place in the Labour Party. I think they should be driven out, they should be disaffiliated, one way or another they should go. On the other hand, the bans that the Labour bureaucracy put in against the left, they should go, and the Labour Party should be open. Precisely whether he wants to come in or not, that's up to him, but organisations like the IBT, organisations like SPEW, Socialist Party in England and Wales, the Communist Party of Great Britain, which of course is sort of my origin party that they put the bans up originally on, those organisations should not only be allowed in, they should be allowed to democratically operate. One condition, if they don't stand candidates against the Labour Party, that is permissible. And what they should be allowed to do is exactly what you quoted Lenin saying, is they should have the freedom to criticise, the freedom to put forward their views. So why split the Labour Party? Why not take the Labour Party? If we look at the trade union movement, the idea, for example, of taking Unite or the PCS or Unison and saying the job of revolutionaries is to get into those unions in order to split off the socialists, the revolutionaries, to me that's just crazy. I mean, the reality is that revolutionists, socialists, Marxists make the best leaders when it comes to strikes, when it comes to protests, when it comes to protecting ordinary people's rights and conditions. Therefore, these very people can have a realistic prospect of taking over the Labour Party, not in order to transform it into a revolutionary party, at least in terms of my understanding of a revolutionary party. How can it be transformed into a revolutionary party? It's a federal party, right? It's got trade unions in it, it's got other affiliated organisations in it. It's a mixture between individual membership and collective membership. Okay.
1 minute.
1 minute.
Yeah.
I personally do have absolute total contempt for anything to do with the cult of personality. To me, that's bankrupt politics. It's got nothing to do with socialism. And when indeed in the Soviet Union, we're talking about in the early days when Lenin died, I sort of understand why they bloody well mummified him, because a load of peasants wanted to come and see him. But this was a disgrace, as was Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev picking up and turning Lenin into a cult, as if everything he said throughout his life was from heaven. It wasn't. Sometimes what Lenin said was right, sometimes what he said was wrong. Well, turning a dead person into a cult is one thing, but what we've seen too many times under so-called socialism, China, Vietnam, the Soviet Union, which I do not regard as having anything to do with socialism, it's a travesty of socialism. They have living people who have a personality cult around. Nothing to do with socialism.
Alright, thanks. HaPe.
Okay, I think I pick up with the first bit of Jack on turning the Labour Party into what he called a permanent united front and equaling it to the potential of the Soviet. Now, the Labour Party is obviously a parliamentary organisation, always has been. That is pretty much the raison d'être of the Labour Party. So it quite clearly wants to operate within bourgeois institutions and achieve its successes there within the parliamentary arena. Soviets traditionally have sprung up precisely as a counter structure by the working class and peasantry in Russia in 1905 and thereafter, where workers went into struggle with the existing feudal and capitalist societies and realized that they couldn't take over these institutions like the parliament, etc., but had to actually crush them, as Marx once famously said, and replace them with structures of power that are run by the working class. And as such, Soviets are not permanent either. We remember, for example, in the German Revolution 1918-1919, or the attempt of it, there were quite strong power struggles between the Social Democrats the majority Social Democrats who were quite clear who were aware that the Räte, as they were called in Germany, posed a deadly threat to the capitalist system, and they quite consciously called for disbanding them, and that's what they succeeded in, against the communists within it, who had ultra-leftist tendencies, but that's another story. And afterwards, the German Social Democrats, who are, in terms of what they represent, pretty much like the German version of Labour, used what later was to become the fascist movement in Germany pretty much to crush the communists and murdered their leaders. And I think this is deeply ingrained in the Labour Party. The Labour Party, as its history, has always been formed around the very idea of a parliamentary road to socialism, and that's not because they're necessarily evil individuals who think communists are all nasty people. It's just an individual perspective of how you can achieve something under capitalism or in general. It's got to do with a slightly confused understanding of what socialism is, which, as I indicated initially, it's got nothing to do with what Marx described as socialism or communism, but with a redistributional model where you just tax the rich a little bit, nationalize a bit here and there, and then everything will be fine, and all the poor people will have a bit better lives, and everything will be great. The state controls roughly that this equilibrium of wealth doesn't get, thrown off balance too much, and that's the social democratic vision, basically. So yes, they need to be split. They need to. Those people within the Labour Party who don't have a crystallized consciousness that quite clearly says from A to Z that we need to maintain the Labour Party as is, need to be won over and away from Corbyn's perspective. They need to be won away from Blair's perspective even more. So that's not even reformism. They were so mainstream that that when people were given the opportunity to vote between Tories and Labour, because the differences were too small, they went with the Tories occasionally. So yes, the Labour Party need to be split. The people need to be won over, and then we'll probably see some movement in broader society as well. Workers can be won over to a Labour Party to a party in contradiction to the Labour Party.
So
sure.
Robert.
Yeah. So I also agree with the splitting of the Labour Party, because if you operate within a party that's full of these right wingers, I support driving out the right, but if you could take the left out and if you could take the bigger left out and leave the right in their little organizations, the Labour Party is one thing, the unions are another thing. Like if you could pull the left out into its own reform organization, because I don't believe that within this within the context of the Labour Party that this bureaucracy has been built up for a long time. It's got no ability to accurately capture the type of person who is being captured right now by the radical liberal movement, and by people who are dissatisfied with the lack of focus on with the lack of sufficient focus, should I say, on identity issues. So I do think we have to split the Labour Party away from this bureaucracy, away from this old school focus, into a new movement which accurately identifies and represents all the intersections of society. And the other thing I would like to say about the whole nationalization issue is that yes, I do believe in the nationalization of the commanding heights. I do believe that it's a transitional step towards socialism. I don't think I have the time to explain it right now, but briefly it involves the institution of social dividends and a cooperative-based economy similar to what Richard Wolff proposed. And I do believe that there are different routes to socialism, like the criticism of, I just don't really think you can criticize something that's been successful by holding on to a theory that's not successful. I think Marxism is a science and it has to evolve. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, on this kind of the idea about splitting the Labour Party seems to come up, and this is kind of a idea which is it seems plausible enough on the surface that you can kind of take these people who are in the Labour Party and kind of put them over there and then kind of work on them in a purer kind of laboratory. I don't kind of follow that. I mean, I have experience as John has as well. We've been through some of those organisations where the Labour left, such as it was, decamped into different organisations. So the first one was called Arthur Scargill's Socialist Labour Party, and it existed in 1996 when I was a student a long time ago. And this was the Labour left decamped into a new after Blair got through the Clause 4 thing. The Labour Party abolished Clause 4. So Clause 4 campaign, Scargill led the campaign to keep Clause 4, lost, went outside the Labour Party. I can tell you from personal experience, those organisations were worse than the Labour Party in terms of operating inside them. I found them. They were, you kind of don't resolve things by just kind of splitting people off in that kind of abstract kind of way. It's better to actually stay inside something, and you've got more chance of making something worthy of the rank and file of the Labour Party if you work with them and work with them through their kind of struggles and engage in those struggles. There's far more to be learned inside for socialists and Marxists by combating the right and conducting a principled political struggle against them than there is about extracting them from the Labour Party and putting them in another organisation. There's lots of things to be kind of learnt. So I'm very sceptical about the split thing also. The last thing I'll raise is about the cult of personality. Well, the cult of personality is interesting, isn't it? Because usually what happens is the people we have a cult of personality around don't actually have a personality. And I think Jeremy Corbyn is actually one of those. Stalin didn't have a personality. Lenin, while he was a great writer and leader and thinker, I don't get the impression he was a great after-dinner speaker or somebody you'd want to spend a long time down the pub with. These people, it's a very bizarre thing, but I do think the cult of personality, I find it in the Labour Party, I find it slightly moronic, actually. This Jez we can, is one of those which I've never chanted and never will, and Jeremy Corbyn. But it is dangerous actually, because it's an emotional response. It's not a political kind of response, and that is pretty much when you see people chanting that, and this kind of at the Labour Party conference, people buying Jeremy Corbyn T-shirts. But when you actually meet the guy, it's kind of really weird. Because he's not, he's the last person you think they're in. But it is an insidious idea, because the reality of life in the Labour Party at the moment is that Jeremy Corbyn hasn't done an awful lot to defend people on the end of witch hunts over various issues. He hasn't defended the left. Actually, what we've seen is he's kowtowed to the right, and so we need to have a completely critical kind of. And I support Jeremy Corbyn. I support him against the right, but I'm not a Jeremy Corbyn clone or sycophant, which is what elements of the left inside the Labour Party. You'll get arguments in the Labour Party, but just to finish, you'll get arguments inside the Labour Party at the moment to say, well, we don't want to rock the boat over expulsions of people like Moshe Mak over the anti-Semitism issue. We don't want to do that because that's wrecking the chance that's making our party more divided. And that means we've less chance of having a Labour government in X year, and that's a wrong perspective, and it needs to be countered. So we should be very sceptical of cults of non-personality.
All right, please join me in thanking our panelists. We've got plenty of time for questions from the audience. We're going to take questions one at a time. And if you want to address your question to a specific panelist, please do, but it would also be good to get responses from the other panelists to all the questions. Lucy?
I've got a question for Robert, but I'd like others to maybe respond afterwards as well. I just want to kind of clarify a bit. I thought your initial comments were very interesting. I just want to clarify or understand a bit more this thing about how you're changing the Labour Party and relating to the people you call radical liberals. I wanted to understand a bit more what you meant by that, and whether you think what I understood that to be is possibly, if I've got this wrong, please tell me, kind of people that support identity politics in a kind of a liberal, but possibly also intersectional way, but from with a liberal perspective. And I just want to ask whether you think intersectionality as such is compatible with socialism, and if so, could you just clarify that a bit for me? How you see it. But I guess a follow-on from that is, within the Labour Party at the moment, obviously there are offices for representing EAME interests, women's interests. How do you see those roles working, and what do you think in a transformed party? What would it? Would you still have offices like that, or what would that look like? And then I'd like other speakers to respond to that as well.
Okay, so on the first question, whether intersectionality is compatible with socialism, I say yes. It is compatible with socialism in the way that... Okay, so let me compose myself a little bit so I can phrase the answer, so I'm not very well. So intersectionality is basically, for those, who here doesn't know what intersectionality is? Okay, so the basis of intersectionality is that we are all oppressed along multiple axes. So it means race, gender, sexuality, orientation, class, all these axes we are oppressed along. So the core idea that makes it work with socialism is that the oppression along these identities affects our access to capital, which means that proportionally, the more oppressed you are along any one or more of these axes, the more likely you are to be in a working class. It makes sense. If you look at things like the gender pay gap, if you look at things like how BME graduates are paid a lot less than their white counterparts, like how LGBT plus people face discrimination in the workplace, it makes sense. So you get this. It's fundamentally wrong to say that intersectionality is incompatible with socialism because it ultimately reflects on class. So class and these other intersections are linked. So to answer your question, it's compatible, and this is what we need to work into, the understanding. So I've recently... So your second question was how it would work, right? In a transformed party, whether within or outside Labour Party. So the answer would be that rather than having officers, you would have, what was mentioned earlier, a federal structure. A federal structure in that each of the cultural national groups would be represented by its own bloc, and separately across cultural national groups, each of these LGBT, the LGBTQ trans representation group, LGBTQ trans representation group, marginalized genders, will all be represented as separate groups. So I'm really glad that you've given me the opportunity to clarify this, because it works there'll be two separate layers. So policy passes through the cultural national groups, and then it's basically a two-house system within the party. So on one level, it passes through it gets initiated and passed either at the cultural national or the marginalized groups level, and then it goes for vetting by the other side. And this is a democratically centralist decision, which means that regardless, so this basically blocks off the argument that could be made that each of these groups fighting for their own interests will not be able to come to a consensus, and it will stall party movement. This is a democratic decision, but it's also effective, efficient, centralist. So yeah, and
Just
yeah,
one more.
that's it. That's it. Yeah.
Is there anyone else who would like to respond to this issue on the panel?
I could do very quickly, but trying to be quick anyway. I think that, if I understood Jack correctly, I think it is potentially problematic, because I fully agree that obviously a revolutionary party has to defend, ethnic minorities, women, LGBT, etc. But the underlying, predominantly formatting thing is always class, I think. So when you look at how women oppression manifests itself specifically, with women's oppression, it's also to do with childbearing and the biological aspects of the human body that come with that. But it's often done on a level whereby the woman, in a way, is presented as, in a similar way how the worker is presented by the capitalist class in liberal media, for example, as stupid, as uneducated, as something lower, not worthwhile, having to do all the heavy lifting in the household and so on. And the same goes along ethnic lines as well. So if you look at the stereotypes levied against, for example, black people in the UK, quite often they're portrayed as like the poor, criminal elements, uneducated, can only succeed in sports and music and so on, but as soon as it comes to like becoming a university professor and so on, surely you cannot, surely no black person can ever be university professor, because that's just, that just doesn't fit into the picture. So there's always this underlying suspicion that these people wouldn't be able to actually succeed and transmit the same knowledge and better knowledge than a lot of their white colleagues.
Oh, yeah,
so
thanks.
yeah, I'll cut it there.
Maybe off there. We'll just the ladies at the back.
Hi. This is just a comment, really. There's a few things that alienated me from, I don't want to say the hard left, but from the more revolutionary left side up until this point very recently. And part of it is this idea of intersectionality not having a place. Part of it is this idea of the class revolution has to come before your revolution. And I think that's just a comment, really. I found it quite alienating. I know I'm not the only one. And I think Bobby is perfectly right. The intersectionalities absolutely have a place in socialism. It can work more that way than the other way, I personally think.
Perhaps I can kind of repose that in a way as a question to get some response to the panelists, because I think a lot of the younger people who have been attracted to Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, and have seen this kind of swell in support, are coming with these kinds of concerns. Right, their concerns are about identity in some way, and they also, trying to think about how that might relate to austerity or anti-austerity, whatever that might mean. In terms of this issue of transforming the Labour Party or building a separate party, to what extent do those kinds of discontents offer a possibility to people who want to kind of explain things in a broader context, or to what extent is it a dead end?
Can I have a go? Well, I, as a proponent, I suppose, of the hard left, would definitely not pose things. First of all, what we've got to do is have the class revolution, and after that, national questions, sexual questions, every other form of oppression has to wait. I think that's a completely incorrect way of posing things. It's true that if you take some sections of the left, certainly in the past, That is exactly how they posed it. So if you take the old militant tendency, what is now called Socialist Party in England and Wales, that was absolutely their position. Homosexuals, we don't have anything to do with homosexuality. Maybe the revolution will cure it. I don't know what exactly their position was, but no, seriously, that's more or less what they said. Women, basically funny-shaped workers, right? No, again, I'm really not exaggerating. I'm really not. When it comes to things like Scotland, no, this is a complete diversion. When it came to Northern Ireland, all of this is rubbish. All of it was viewed as a diversion from the struggle. So I understand the question. On the other hand, when I look at, in terms of my history, not personally, but my history as our movement, I think we'd agree. I mean, I would call myself a Bolshevik. When I look at the Bolsheviks, whatever was wrong with them, they did take the women's question seriously. It was not a question of saying, when we overthrow the Tsar, or when we have socialism, then women can have their rights. There was quite clearly an argument in the feminist movement between the Bolsheviks and the socialists on the one hand, and then bourgeois feminists on the other. The bourgeois feminists were saying, well, first of all, we, members of the bourgeoisie, need equal rights with our male class, husbands, etc. In other words, when it came to votes, they were saying we should have the vote, right? Not those people. Right? There should be equality between men and women. The Bolsheviks, along with the German social democracy and that whole movement, were actually saying no, everyone should have the vote, for example. Now I would include, in terms of our struggle for socialism, precisely taking up all examples of oppression and fighting for them now, but also with the understanding that in terms of full liberation, and I include the working class in that is impossible under capitalism, that is impossible under what I would call socialism, or you would call some sort of transitional workers' state. We actually believe in human liberation, and in my view, that's only possible when we get rid of exploitation and the division of labour. So that's my version of it. So it's not a question of counterposing one against the other. It's actually drawing up all forms of oppression into a movement for universal human liberation.
Lyndon, do you want to say something about young people who are being drawn into the Labour Party?
Yeah, well, the Labour Party does have the Labour Party does have the way the Labour Party deals with this question is really kind of like, so you'll have, particularly on their kind of thing is, so if there's a certain there's a certain group of posts that are drawn up in the Labour Party, there's a kind of rigid rule that you have to have a certain amount of like women going into them kind of like posts. And I find that kind of response to these kind of questions quite arbitrary and quite kind of bureaucratic. It actually ended up in a situation in my branch. So there was a positions come up for general council delegates. You have all these bloody positions in the Labour Party. So there's 8 positions open, and so there's 4 for the men and 4 for the women. So that actually ended up, I think, in 2 women who were very unwilling to become GC delegates because it's so boring, but ended up being shepherded into it. That is not my kind of vision of liberation for women, is to have people kind of press ganged into taking on boring posts that they don't want to do. And I think that's we should be kind of beware of that kind of, and we should be aware of that quota. My kind of response to those kind of things is that what I'm interested in is people's ability. I'm not interested in to say I'm not interested in their gender or their race would be stupid, because obviously that structures their existence in our current society. I'm not putting it like that, but really and that culture doesn't exist in the Labour Party, where we have a conception of people, it's your ability that's the most important thing, and the other things really should be secondary in my kind of view. So I'd be kind of beware of that kind of. Also as well, what John says is perfectly kind of true. When I was it wasn't even, the revolutionary left was a very conservative place place when I joined it. When I joined my first revolutionary group when I was doing A-levels, I got kind of told things like, oh, I used to have a haircut that looked like the Jesus and Mary chain with kind of like this kind of, and it's like that's not really the kind of image we want to portray on Oxford High Street on a Saturday morning. So that gives you an indication of the kind of conservatism. But by that point, by the time I joined the revolutionary left, it had begun to come out of that kind of cul-de-sac, and there was a kind of a better awareness of people, things like gay oppression and things like that, which was very different to the kind of working class culture that I was brought up with. So I don't have any solutions to this, but I would definitely say the bureaucratic structures which the Labour Party of quotas and 50-50 shortlists, that's not kind of any. I don't see that's any kind of resolution to developing kind of talented female activists. It just ends up as being what it is, a quota system in which you have, and there is a benefit, I suppose, because there's more women in leading positions, but it doesn't actually resolve the issue in Labour Party meetings of authority. It's usually the Labour Party men who talk with more authority than the women, so because their structural inequalities are by way, so.
Yes.
Yes, the lady.
Yeah, my name's Anne. So I'm French. I've been here for a while, but my assumption of the Labour Party comes from the French perspective, which is that generally in the Anglo-Saxon world, the spectrum of the political spectrum is way more to the right than in the rest of Europe or anywhere else, right? So who would call themselves revolutionary here? Just as a question.
On this panel?
Yeah, on this panel. Exactly. So in my opinion, Labour here is so much more to the right. So why are you saying? Why are you even fighting to stay in a Labour which is like literally rooted within a capitalist democratic society? Because my definition of revolution, right, is overthrowing a system, overthrowing a regime. So then my next question is, what's your point of view on democracy and authoritative regimes? Because I feel there's both qualities in both of them. And in this country, and mainly in Western democracies, there's a massive tendency a massive taboo around criticizing democracy. And I don't understand it personally, but also what I'm surprised that I haven't heard anything from anarchism in its deeply essential definition, because that anarchism is a great ideology, I think, in that it holds people into power into account, right? But it doesn't say fuck the system, right? It only says we'll go out of the system, which is nowadays capitalism, only if the people in power aren't checked and do not respond to our definition of just and equal, right? So I'm just curious about first your view on democracy and authoritative regime, and then why the no mention of anarchism.
All right, anyone want to jump on that first?
Can I?
Please.
Yeah.
Try and keep it to 2 minutes.
2 minutes, right. Bang, 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 bang. Okay. First of all, why stay in the Labour Party? Why would I advocate, I should say, people staying in the Labour Party? Well, in the same way that I would advocate people staying in, I don't know if you remember it, Lyndon, the EETPU, which is one of our trade unions that's now in Unite. It used to be led by the communists in the 1950s. They were found to be fixing the ballots, so I disassociate myself from that, but it became the most right-wing union in Britain. The leader would get up at every TUC and denounce the communists, denounce the miners' strike and all the rest of it. Should the communists have walked out? In my view, no, they should have won it. It's now part of Unite. I'm not saying that Unite's a fantastic union, but nevertheless, stay in. I accept what you're saying about Europe, but in the same way, what you need to recognise, not about America, but about Britain, is that for whatever reason we ended up with, because we had, I suppose, such massively strong trade unions, where Europe had weak trade unions, big, powerful, well, compared with Britain. Compared with Britain, there's no doubt about it. We had, in 1900, 6-7 million, CGT, anyway, the point's being made. big unions in Britain, small socialist organisations. So in that sense, the working class produced Labourism, right? So my argument is that this is unique to Britain. It's not something I'd want to copy. It's not something I want to export to France or America. In terms of your other points, my position is one of extreme democracy. I'm in favour of overcoming democracy through extreme democracy, i.e., my view of democracy is a form of the state. As a communist, I want to get rid of the state. And I would want to get rid of the state through having more and more democracy, precisely so that people do view positions, like Lyndon's been talking about, oh, I have to be an MP, as a bore, right? Merely administering things. It has no prestige, no authority. That's my vision.
I'm sorry, but if you say I want to get rid of the state, you're not communist, you're an anarchist.
No, I'm a communist.
So
I'm a Marxist. Marx definitely said he wants to get rid of the state.
Yeah, but then, there's a transition period.
I agree. And that should be one of extreme democracy. That's really my argument. But anyway, I really haven't got the time. But yeah, extreme democracy, and then we get rid of the state.
Okay.
So in that sense, I'm an anarchist. In terms of getting rid of the state, yeah.
Robert and then HaPe.
Yeah. So the first question on the Labour Party, can't really comment because I do know the European context is a lot further left. Like, I mean, I know a bit about the Italian and Spanish context compared to the UK context. But yeah. So moving on from that, because I can't really comment on that. But like the thing about democracy, now this is interesting. I support workplace democracy. So I support the formation of, as a transitional stage between like socialism and communism. I support the direct ownership of the means of production by the workers who work there. So like workers' cooperatives and which are democratically and like semi-directly managed. But on the other hand, I also support the power of a vanguard party. So like things like the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, China, Vietnam, Cuba. All these are parties that I support and like I look to as historical examples. So so you do need a strong guiding force for society on the way to communism. If not, you just lose your way. Like you have to have like a beacon. You have to have like somebody like showing the way for you. But you can't rely on spontaneity. You can't rely on people spontaneously rising up. There's no such thing as a movement without leaders. So what I believe is that democratize the workplace, but have a firm hand on the state until it comes to and progressively fold up the democratic structures of the workplace into the state. So yeah, I don't have much time to elaborate on my governing structure, but I do have one planned out. Yeah.
Thanks. HaPe briefly.
Yeah, I think ultimately every revolutionary aims for maximum democracy, but revolutions are probably happening on a national level at first. So the case of Russia was one, for example, and I'm getting back to that because it's the concrete example we can think of, perhaps, where the bourgeois state was destroyed. It was replaced by what I would indeed call a worker state, or the dictatorship of the proletariat, as Marx called it. And that brings dangers with it. First of all, if you're surrounded, you only have a certain amount of raw material. Russia was an extremely poor place at the time, so no matter how democratically you want to run society, you have the first problem is food, for example, and that was very specifically in Russia's case, and would be in various other countries in the world today exactly also the case. What do we do now? We have the power, very limited food resources. How do we keep the people? How do they keep themselves happy when there isn't enough to eat for everybody? That in itself is a driver potentially for dictatorial measures, and it was one of the key drivers to drive the Soviet Union, for example, into a regime where at first certain dictatorial measures were applied. So, say for example, initially it was just the Communist Party and various other groupings that succeeded in the revolution. Some of them rose up against the Bolsheviks, like the social revolutionaries they were called. Then, so the Bolsheviks crushed them. Then the Bolsheviks were the only organization pretty much running the country. There were factions within the Communist Party effectively organizing an external tendency, so they were crushed. And then this what was meant to be a temporary state was crystallized under Stalin effectively to a dictatorship where that was the ideal Bolshevism and everything had to be run that way. Just 2 sentences on anarchism quickly. Anarchism we have one historical example in the Spanish Civil War where anarchists did actually effectively had the power, certainly in a large part of Spain, Catalonia especially, but said they didn't want to have the power. And that led to a massive problem theoretically also to the anarchists, because on the one hand some of them realized, okay, what do we do now? Do we pass the power back to the bourgeois government, the Popular Front government, or do we destroy the bourgeois government and replace it by a government of anarchism? But it would have been exactly that kind of government and state formation that anarchism theoretically despises. And so they unfortunately ended up the majority of the CNT in supporting the bourgeois government, and that contributed in the defeat of the revolution in Spain and the victory of fascism, unfortunately.
Lyndon, is there anything you want to add there?
Yeah, just quickly on authority and democracy. I don't think you can't talk about authority and democracy. They're not two mutually exclusive poles. Okay, Jeremy Corbyn, as an example, has got quite a lot of authority by the fact that he.
I mean, authoritative as in.
Yeah, authoritative. That's what I mean. But Corbyn has got a platform to be authoritative and have authority because he won 2 elections and he won 2 different.
Okay, but for example, in the democratical fault that I see is that in terms of ideology, yes, it's the best one, right? Power to the people. Okay, but in terms of dogma, as you mentioned earlier, the massive problem in our today's system generally is that it works around the electoral calendar, right? So that means that everyone's trying to push their agenda. You might agree with the agenda, or you might not completely not agree with it. But that's the main fundamental flaw that I see in democracy. And I'm saying that all you being revolutionary should think about just something else. I don't have the answer, but democracy as an ideology is, but as a systematic dogma isn't.
But in terms of, well then, to propose to that, I mean, I don't believe in the current, it's better to get a vote than not have one, but I don't believe the system's democratic. I mean, I'd want yearly recallable parliaments, and in the Labour Party, if there's a Labour MP who steps out of line, they should be instantly recallable. I think the solution to the problem which you've identified, which is dogma and a misuse of authority, I think is more democracy. And the more democracy that you have, if somebody can survive the wave of yearly recallable parliaments and instant recallability as MPs, I suggest they'd be much better MPs and leaders than the current shower of shit that we have at the moment.
Okay, I've got a couple of people who indicated we will try our best to get to you also, if we can keep responses quick, but first Nancy.
Hey, so I wanted to kind of return back to this question about young people and why they're turning to the left, especially around Corbyn. So I was recently at this momentum event for the Lambeth Labour Council, where they were talking about problems of trying to strategize for the 2018 local elections. And what they were coming up against was this problem of ideas. They were concerned with how they're going to appeal to people, because the problem that people in Momentum are having right now, it seems to be that even if they get all these young Labour councillors on the basis of anti-gentrification, on the basis of anti-austerity, and on the basis of identity politics, these young Labour councillors are in, that even if Jeremy Corbyn's PM, that austerity will continue to be implemented nonetheless. And so the panel was posing was like this, like how do we change the ideas that these young people have about what's possible? Because the obstacle that they were coming up against was that actually anti-gentrification, anti-austerity, identity politics aren't really new and have all been tried. And it seems like like they were saying, like, we have this left Labour council that still isn't implementing the policies we want. So it's it seems like it's not necessarily a problem. It seems like there's a problem with the party itself. I mean, I don't know if I'm just kind of like making a comment here. I don't know how to pose it as a question, but maybe you guys could respond to that. It'd be great if you could all respond to that.
Okay, so I guess one way that I might reframe the question is that a lot of people who coming into the Labour Party with discontents about anti-gentrification and anti-austerity and so on, they want some kind of state redistributive justice, and that's the horizon of their politics in a certain way. Now, having 4 self-proclaimed revolutionaries on the panel, how would you attempt to, what does it mean to push people beyond their boundaries of what they think is possible in politics? Does anyone, quickly, 2 minutes.
Well, first of all, I think that, Momentum is a bit of a peculiar organisation. It's owned by one person, it's run by one person, yes, in the service at the moment of Jeremy Corbyn. I'm sure they'll come up against all sorts of barriers. I don't know how the hell they're going to resolve it. Does it last? I don't know. I really don't know. But when it comes to councils, look, in Britain, councils have become more or less completely powerless, right? So if you become a councillor, it's worse than being an MP. At least an MP can vote how they want. So Jeremy Corbyn could rebel. If you become a councillor, you rebel, you're chucked out of the Labour group. Councils in Britain are under a legal obligation to carry out sensible balanced budgets and all the rest of it. Okay, socialist parties put forward you can do this and you can do that. My answer to that is simply to say that the best thing revolutionaries can do is to tell the truth. And that's really in reply to also what you were saying about, no, the job of revolutionaries isn't, here's the general election, let's promise people, loads of goodies and wonderful things because we think that's going to be acceptable to them. We've actually got to tell them the truth. And so if we're putting forward someone to stand for the council, my view would be, look, I can do bugger all, right? And that's the truth. I can mobilise you, right? But personally, in terms of a councillor, I can't do bugger all. In the same way, actually, that if you're elected as an MP, for that matter, we need to tell people the truth and not tell people that everything in terms of this system can be made wonderful. It cannot.
Yeah, unfortunately, I see this, and I've been to similar meetings where people have discussed the local council, what can we do, and sometimes the right wing councillors have been there also. But also, we've got a long kind of tragic history in this country, and from the 1980s, of municipal kind of socialism. The idea that you could build little red bases in places like Sheffield and Liverpool, and those regimes. The militant one in Liverpool being the most disastrous one, they precisely show the limitations. Even if you've got a citywide Liverpool council, ultimately, and they made a glaring error. Their error was precisely that they stuck narrowly to the priorities of their council, and they came to kind of a deal with the Conservative government at the time, and they didn't join up with the miners' strike and other kind of struggles that were going on at the time, which shows the kind of limitations to that. There is this kind of, it's really dangerous. I find it quite insidious in the Labour Party at the moment, because if you get young and enthusiastic people coming on to Labour Party meetings, usually they will have a discussion. The local councillors will have a discussion with you. Why don't you come along to some council meetings and see how it all kind of works? And I find that there's nothing wrong with it, But I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to, like, you know, I'll take you into this kind of system and I'll show you, you know, this is what happens here, and this is the way that they do, this is the way we kind of run things, to take them out of that kind of thing. And I'd be very kind of sceptical about, like, turning into a new generation of... There have been movements recently on the left to say, well, yeah, we should all become councillors. But it's very difficult to be in a situation, which I agree with John, which you're fairly kind of powerless to achieve anything. So I would beware of the municipal kind of strategies of socialism.
We've got about 10 or 15 minutes remaining, and I'm loath to do this, but I'm going to take 3 questions, and then if we can see who wants to respond to them, I'll write them down to keep a note, and then get some closing comments. So firstly, this woman back there.
Yeah. I'm also a member of the IBT, my name is Roxanne. I'll start with a couple of questions and kind of say what I think maybe the answers to these are as well. How best do we break the illusions that people have in Labour and Labourism? Everyone on the panel agrees that that's a massive problem. And how do we raise people's consciousness to a revolutionary one? And consciousness is a massive, or I think one of the most important things to be able to build a revolutionary movement. I was particularly curious to hear from Lyndon, because I couldn't really disagree with everything you were saying about the Labour Party, and I think at one point you called it a huge and formidable roadblock to building a revolutionary party or another kind of party. I mean, you only dedicated one line at the end to what we should be doing, and you said, well, I'm not quite sure, maybe at the moment, a bigger party with all tendencies in it, you said. If the Labour Party presents all these challenges and is so dangerous, actually, for us as revolutionaries in this country, because it is a massive roadblock, I agree with that. So how do we as revolutionaries relate to the Labour Party? Okay, let's give it critical support sometimes, if that's the way to engage it, but not all the time. Let's recognise when it implements cuts locally, which it does all the time, which we've all recognised. How do we relate to it as revolutionaries? I think, Robert, you said, well, we definitely can't transform it. I mean, however you define a split, programmatically there are differences here. Some people want revolution, some people want to work within the framework of capitalism, which is what Miliband originally described, Lyndon, that you quoted. And that is what the Labour Party is. It is a way to contain revolution within a capitalist framework. That's why it exists. So if we work in the Labour Party, let's use our time wisely. If we're going to go in there and try and win people, let's make it a time-limited thing that actually has an impact. Harper mentioned deep entryism versus something where we can actually polarise. So Lyndon, do you see yourself still being in the Labour Party, for example, when Corbyn becomes Prime Minister and betrays our class in a more explicit way?
No, I'll be expelled by then. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, very likely, because the bureaucracy is a real thing, but I'm more interested in programme. I mean, you know, maybe Jeremy Corbyn will be the Prime Minister of the country. Either way, he will stick to his politics, which is making capitalism a bit nicer and maintaining it. So how do we relate to it as revolutionaries?
We've got the 2 gentlemen next to each other there. Sorry, if...
All right, yeah, sure. How big a role do you think a Corbyn-MacDonald-led administration would give to foreign policy, particularly to the former British Empire overseas territories, such as Gibraltar and particularly the Falklands? I'm sorry, just... Well, I agree with the French woman that... I'm sorry, I don't know. That the sort of Anglo-Saxon politics, the centre ground of Anglo-Saxon politics, is perhaps more to the right than the Europeans' neighbours. Wouldn't you agree that now under Corbyn things have sort of matched up, at least?
Thanks. And gentlemen.
All of you except for Mr. White have rejected Labour, but the reality at the end of the day is they're the most electorally successful left-wing party in Britain. The UK is a conservative small-c country. How do you reconcile your revolutionary with this kind of democratic socialism? Most times when we see countries move away from capitalism, it does involve mass hardship, starvation, poverty, killings even. Can you just be honest here? You want full-blown authoritarianism because your views are relatively niche in British society. They'll never be voted in.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's the questions we've got time for, so we'll take responses to all of those and then some closing remarks. Lyndon, do you want to start with Roxanne's?
Yeah, very briefly. In terms of how do you deal with this huge roadblock? Well, it is a roadblock and it is frustrating, but I think there's eminently more for the left to gain by actually battling with a live octopus than this kind of live octopus of the Labour Party. I think through those struggles, that actually makes the kind of organisation that we'd like to see much more compelling, because it's you're dealing with something live. It's not like kind of sitting in a desiccated way and looking at something and trying to classify it. There's a lot to be gained individually and as groups by having to confront that every day, by actually having to phrase like left-wing arguments to audiences who are in some cases like hostile to you, and there's also a lot to be gained in kind of democratic terms through having to face down things like bureaucratic witch hunts and expulsions. Organisations and groups that come out of those real live democratic processes, when you have to deal with that, are going to be much more hardy as kind of like real kind of like mass socialist organisations than ones that are formed in a kind of laboratory and kind of cooked up in a kitchen somewhere miles away. That's kind of my perspective on that. Consciousness is a huge topic, and I don't think I can appreciate it. You should just read Lukács's history in class. It's got all the answers in it. But that is a kind of a huge issue. And just on what you said, I agree with you that Britain, as currently constituted, is a small C conservative country, right? That's been its history, right?
You're working within the system, all the others.
But I'm working within the system, but I'm also working in a weird system that I would have said to you 3 years ago, the chances of Jeremy Corbyn becoming Labour leader and the Labour Party being yanked to the left, as it currently is, was a far-fetched kind of thing. Things can change, things can move on, and things can who knows where, who knows what the possibilities are, never mind accidents of history, which Corbyn undoubtedly is. So society is not a fixed kind of thing. There are big conservative tendencies in our country, and I do not think the way to win conservative-minded people is to harp on about the authoritarian glories of the Soviet Union or China or whatever the workers' fatherland that we might identify with, because we have to disassociate ourselves from this. The problem with the Russian Revolution in microcosm is that it lost its democratic impulse and it became authoritarian, and that Stalinism and Leninism is a huge problem, and I don't call myself a Stalinist or a Leninist anymore for those reasons. So sorry, it's a bit of a pat.
No, thanks.
The first question, how we raise consciousness. Well, that's something I'm still working out, but I suspect a lot of it would have to do with getting control, or not control, but like getting space in the media, getting your views put through in creative works to the public, as well as through the more mundane enlightenment through news, through stuff like that, to use current controversies as a springboard into revolutionizing mindsets. So for example, every time there is a crisis, something is shaken loose, and we can catch that something. So what's the second question again? Foreign policy, right?
There was a question on foreign policy under Corbyn and MacDonald, particularly Gibraltar and the Falklands.
Not too sure.
Or
Sorry
foreign
about
policy.
that.
What do you imagine foreign policy? What does it mean for the left under a Corbyn and MacDonald?
Under a Corbyn and MacDonald government, I think I suppose there will be more opposition to starting new wars, but I'm not too sure whether there will be whether they can resist the pressures of like lobbyists, just because like throughout all its governments, throughout all its Labour and Conservative governments, Britain has been at war. The Malayan emergency, that was something that was British, that was a Labour government. Which one was that? I can't remember.
45, Attlee.
Attlee, yes. Clement Attlee, Malayan emergency, and through that, like, they've been, like, Britain is a colonial country. There are pressures within it there always will be pressures within it to be colonialist and, like, maintain that in its foreign policy. So I don't think we can have a genuinely anti-colonial policy under the Labour Party. The final question is on authoritarianism. I believe it's good. I mean, you have to say this. Like, you have to say firmly that there are some things that are unacceptable. There are some things that I'm not saying that we shoot everybody in the street. That's not what authoritarianism necessarily means. What it means is that you use the power of authority to suppress things that are counter-revolutionary, things that are anti-socialist. So stuff like the little C conservatives, like, you go through the education system, like, you can put socialist tenets into the education system. That is what, like, did you know that? I mean, I've heard a lot of stuff about how people don't know about the colonial history. About the colonial history of Britain, stuff like that. Like, it's the education system, stuff like that. It doesn't have to necessarily mean grabbing people off the street, jailing them, throwing them in gulags. No, that's not necessarily what authoritarianism means. It means a full penetration of an ideology within society to give it a firm guiding hand. And that is what I mean by authoritarianism, like an unshakable force that guides towards the revolution.
Are you Singaporean or Malaysian?
Singaporean.
Okay, so you like a Lee Kuan Yew style penetration in society. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, let's start off with authoritarianism. I mean, Rob correctly mentioned colonialism. The British government overseas certainly has been involved in a lot of authoritarianism. If we think about Afghanistan and Iraq, started wars that quite clearly were, even by its own standards, illegal. Still, we got the former Labour Prime Minister walking the streets. We got authoritarianism, perhaps not in the political system as much as in real lives of people, where yes, you can vote every 4 years, or perhaps this time around, perhaps the periods might be a bit shorter. But you have people who get thrown out into the streets, made homeless. We've got 500,000 homeless in this country. If we talk about authoritarianism, democracy and freedom, I think that's a big question. What is freedom? Is freedom just when you can make your cross every 4 or 5 years, or is it when you're actually deprived of your livelihoods and you're pressured day to day because your wages get cut and your train fares rise? You can't afford a house, you can't afford your rent, and so on. That's unfreedom. That puts people in very awkward positions. So that's the silent authoritarianism that the capitalist system breeds, and it doesn't necessarily require what we consider an authoritarian regime, I don't think.
What would you say for people that don't agree with your views? Because in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew serially bankrupted opponents. Our friend from Singapore supports that model.
I was referring earlier to time-limited periods where I think yes, you can use authoritarian methods. I used the example of the Soviet Union. I don't think it's desirable, but there are certain pressures that every state uses, the state of emergency, where these measures are legitimized by everybody. So we have to be honest about it and say, yeah,
the state of emergency is never good in any democracy or authoritarian.
This is the problem with you guys, because as soon as the mask slips, there's actually quite a sinister agenda. The guy on the right here I respect, the guy on the left was talking about mass expulsion of Jewish people from the Labour Party. I have to admit, once the mask slips, there is a sinister feeling there.
There's also colonialism, right? So I think you've got there's a massive argument to say that in terms of colonialism, expansion of ideology, right? I mean, communism was...
I was just saying that colonialism breeds or has its very fundamentals within an authoritarian system abroad. That is exactly what colonialism does.
Yeah, but that's exactly what the Soviet Union did as well, right? So expanding the Soviet Union meant that it was done in an essential
I agree with you.
colonialism way. But like when you say, so for example, in Singapore, right? You talk about colonialism, post-colonialism. In Singapore, my vision, my idea is that they sort of internalize colonialism as well, because they've got a massive visa system that's non-democratic, and it's also a despotic regime, right? But their view...
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to...
I mean, to synthesize is their view as a society. I mean, Singapore as a society, you can't bring colonialism or post-colonialism up if you agree with Marxism in Singapore.
What?
I mean, it's just a...
Internal Security Act, mate. You know
Yeah, I know.
the history of Singapore, so don't try and be facetious, yeah?
Oh, no.
Why
Okay.
are you referring to the one non-white person called Panelists that the French with Singapore as well?
Oh no, like no. I'm happy to answer this. Like
No, because
This guy knows more about authoritarianism than probably all of the panelists
Okay.
combined, so it's a respectful comment.
no, I'm happy to answer that question. Like the thing about, I mean, I fully understand the dangers of being a Marxist in Singapore. Like I have to keep my stuff. Like I generally don't like talk about it in public back home. So I mean, I fully understand the dangers, but I maintain that it's necessary. It was necessary. It is necessary for the maintenance of the security of the people and and it can and should be replaced. And I can and do want to replace it. And here's the difference between a country like Singapore and a country like the UK or like America. Like here, and in Singapore, you can actually take a parliamentary route to socialism. It's a long theory, but it basically involves the absolute power being in the state and the ability to go. I mean, if you go into the state, you have command of the state institutions. Like it's not like here. Well, it can be like here if you get an entire parliament and you can get a parliament that actually has command, but not likely here. But in Singapore, new country, strong institution, weak constitution.
very
Thanks. Thanks to all of you for that exchange, but I am conscious of time, but we will have a chance to continue the conversation afterwards. I just want to have a chance for Jack to come in. There's been
I do think that HaPe, I don't know if you want to...
Oh, sorry, did I miss
He was cut short. So
Yes,
maybe
sorry about that.
okay. A couple of other points.
Second point, quickly on raising consciousness. I think there are two ways for this. One is for the student types amongst us who like to read books. Obviously, that can help to, reflect on certain things and come to new insights. The other one is, I think, successes in certain struggles where you realize that actually, for example, in strikes or in preventing fascists from marching, for example, when you are successful in these operations, it will show you actually that you collectively have a certain power that can be mobilized, that helps people thinking, oh, actually, if we did these kinds of things in other areas of life as well, we might actually achieve something much bigger and don't have to rely necessarily just on electoral systems, but use these things in direct links with electoral systems like councils, for example, where exactly the people that are involved in struggle are electing who's going to be leading of a specific council, etc. And leave it there.
Okay, well, I haven't used the word roadblock to describe the Labour Party, and I don't think I would at the present time. To me, it's a tremendous opportunity. It's something that the left should grasp with both hands. I think you asked about Labourism, Parliament. To me, the fact that we actually have the vote in Britain shows you that this is not a conservative country. I agree that you could describe it at various times with small c, but as far as I know, the bourgeoisie as a class, the aristocracy as a class, never championed one person, one vote. That was something that was fought for by the left, by the Chartists, by the suffragette movement, supported by the early Labour Party and all the rest of it. And I think we only had actually anything you could really describe as universal suffrage, wasn't it in the 1920s that we actually got it in Britain. I won't deal with foreign policy, but I will say in terms of this whole discussion that we've just ended with, to me Singapore is a capitalist country, a fully capitalist country. To me, you know, I'm not saying that all capitalist countries are the same, right? They're not. But to me, what?
The land, though, the state owns 90% of the land.
I know, but this is my whole point. Let me. I can't engage with a heckle. All I was trying to explain, and I did try to explain that in my opening remarks, is that for Marxists, real Marxists, for Karl Marx type Marxist, nationalisation and socialism are not the same. One is not the transition to the other. As Marx famously said, if that was the case, then the Pharaoh or Bismarck was a socialist. They weren't, right? No, they weren't. What a discovery. From our point of view, it is not about nationalisation. That was what the Labour Party said in clause 4. But for Marxists, it's about control from below, right? It's about us developing our personalities, not from top down, but in terms of ordinary people expanding their power over their lives. That is Marxism. Right? And anybody who tells you it's about nationalise this, or 400 companies there, or building a big state, or having a powerful army, do not understand anything about Marxism. They can call it socialism if they want, but to me it's state socialism, bureaucratic socialism. Anyone who tells me, sorry, I mean, I used to think it, so I'm being perfectly critical here, that the Soviet Union in the 1930s had anything to do with the working class ruling is talking rubbish. It was oppression of the working class. Now, merely because we look at present day Britain and we say, well, here we are, we can voice our views, that doesn't mean that I'm looking forward to social collapse, poverty. No, quite the opposite. My view is that the more powerful individuals become, the more powerful their own organisations become, the more attractive and the more feasible the idea of socialism is. So my socialism is not the result of poverty grinding people down, oppress them, and then they will rebel and all the rest of it. No, it's the exact opposite. The richer people are, right? The more they're organised, the more educated they are, to me, the more attractive the idea of socialism becomes. Just one final point. Yes, I'm in favour of the expulsion of the Jewish labour movement. Why? This is from the Labour Party. Why? Because it's a racist organisation, right? It supports the state of Israel, which is perhaps the most racist state that exists on the planet at the present time. I make no apology for that. I'm an anti-racist, and I'm not expelling Jews. If you're talking about it expelling Jews, there's a Jew who's been expelled from the Labour Party. You can read his article in Labour Party Marxists, that's Maciej Makowa. Read his article and tell me if you can spot any racism in that article. He's an anti-racist, but also what he is, he's an anti-Zionist.
Alright, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of the panel. Please join me.